My name is Joao, and for many years of my life, I ran away from God. I grew up hearing about him, attending church services, and living in a Christian environment. However, despite all that, I always felt resistance inside of me. It was as if no matter how much God was around me, something in me wouldn't let him into my heart. Today, looking back, I clearly see how he never gave up on me, even when I did everything to avoid him. I was born into a humble family, but one that was very united. My mother was a woman with unshakable faith. She always said that God took care of every detail of our lives, and I could see how real that was to her. We would wake up early every day, and before anything else, she would gather us to pray together. At night, before going to bed, there was always a Bible reading, followed by more prayers. At that time, I was just a child, and honestly, all of that seemed like a routine, something we did because it was what my mother wanted. I thought that if God was so good, why didn't I feel anything special when she prayed? It seemed like these experiences she had with God never reached me. On Sundays, we went to church, and while everyone sang and got emotional, I just sat there, not understanding what was so special about it. It was as if there was an invisible barrier between me and the faith my mother valued so much. My father was very different. He was a hardworking, honest man, but not as involved in spiritual matters as my mother. He didn't oppose her faith, but he didn't follow it with the same fervor either. To him, God was something personal, something each person should seek on their own, in their own time. Perhaps because of that, I ended up relating more to him. I saw my father as an example that it was possible to be a good person without being so involved with church or faith. As time passed, I started to drift away from the things of God. Even as a child, I would look for excuses not to go to church or participate in the family prayers. My mother, though noticing this, never forced me. She always said that God had his time for everyone and that one day I would understand. Deep down, I thought all of that was beautiful, but it wasn't for me. It was as if I didn't fit into that world of faith and devotion. I didn't understand it at the time, but God was already calling me. Looking back, I see so many moments when he was trying to reach me, but I refused to listen. Whether through a word I heard at church, a piece of advice from my mother, or even a feeling of emptiness that was starting to grow within me, God was there knocking on the door of my heart. But in my stubbornness, I kept running. Even in the simplest situations of childhood, when I faced problems or difficulties, my mother always taught me to pray and trust in God. But instead of seeking answers in him, I kept sinking deeper into a silent resistance. I didn't want to rely on something I couldn't see, feel, or honestly, fully believe in. That's how my early years passed, with God trying to reach me, still young, beginning to build a life based on the idea that I could run from him. Little did I know how far that running would take me, or how, in the end, God had bigger plans than I could ever imagine. Entering adolescence, my resistance to God became even stronger. That indifference I felt as a child started turning into a clearer rebellion. I was no longer just a boy uninterested in God. Now I wanted to deliberately distance myself from anything that had to do with him. The more my mother talked about faith, prayer, and miracles, the more I closed myself off. In school, things started to change. I remember how important it was to be accepted, to be part of a group. At that stage of my life, religion seemed like a burden. I wanted to be modern, to be part of the conversations my friends were having about parties, relationships, and fun. God and church didn't fit into that world, at least in my mind. I felt embarrassed when someone mentioned how involved my mother was in faith. And over time, I distanced myself even more from the idea of following in her footsteps. That was when friendships began to greatly influence my choices. I surrounded myself with people who had a completely different view from what I had grown up hearing. They talked about enjoying life to the fullest, without worrying about what came after. Parties, drinking, relationships, all of that seemed so tempting. And the more I got involved, the more I felt I was heading in the opposite direction of what my mother always wanted for me. I remember one particular moment that left a mark. I was at home and my mother once again tried to get me to pray with her. I was already irritated by the subject, and that day I responded with more anger than usual. I told her I didn't believe in any of that prayers made no difference in my life, and that I didn't want to be part of something that made no sense to me. She looked at me with pain in her eyes, a look I'll never forget, but she said nothing. She just left the room, and later that night I heard her crying in prayer for me. Even so, my heart remained hardened. I couldn't understand how much she cared or how much she believed God could transform me. At school, I continued to make poor choices. I started going to parties where there was much more than just innocent fun. Alcohol and other things began to be a regular part of my life. At first, I thought I was living the best time of my life. My friends were there, laughing, having fun, and I felt accepted, part of something bigger. But as time went on, I began to feel an even deeper emptiness inside me. The joy that was once innocent was now gone. It was as if I was always searching for something I could never find. There were moments when things started to spiral out of control. One of my closest friends got involved in a serious car accident after a party where we had been drinking a lot. He survived, but the emotional impact it had on me was deep. I started asking myself, where is all of this leading me? Even with these thoughts, I still resisted. Deep down, I knew I was heading in the wrong direction, but at the same time, I couldn't admit it. It was as if admitting I was wrong meant recognizing that my mother had been right all along, and my pride wouldn't allow that. Gradually, I became more withdrawn. I began to deal with feelings of loneliness and frustration, but instead of seeking help, I sank deeper. Conversations with my mother became almost non-existent. I avoided her whenever possible, and when we did talk, they were quick arguments. She never stopped praying for me, and I knew that. Sometimes I'd walk by her room and hear her saying my name in her prayers. She cried out to God, asking him not to give up on me. But in my arrogance, I thought I didn't need anyone, least of all God. This phase of my life was marked by a profound resistance to what I knew deep down was right. I fought against God, fought against my mother, and fought against myself. Every choice I made seemed to push me further away from a path I could have followed one day. I was building a life based on my own desires, but with a void that no party, no relationship, or achievement could fill. Even in moments of happiness, something inside me remained unsatisfied. I began to realize that no matter how much I ran, something greater was calling me. But I was still far from accepting that call. I was trapped in a cycle of rebellion, thinking I could find happiness on my own, without realizing that the more I ran from God, the deeper I was sinking into an emptiness that seemed endless. As I entered adulthood, the consequences of my choices began to appear clearly. That rebellion that had marked my teenage years started to take a toll. What used to be just nights of partying and reckless fun turned into heavy burdens I had to carry every day. Right after finishing school, I found myself lost regarding what to do with my future. While many of my friends were starting to move on with their lives, going to college, finding stable jobs, I found myself stagnant. I had no clear plan, no purpose. My focus had always been on living in the moment, and now that lifestyle was leaving me behind. I tried to ignore the feeling of failure, occupying myself with temporary jobs and running from reality. But the truth was that life was moving forward, and I wasn't going anywhere. I started working in jobs that had nothing to do with what I wanted, but by that point, I didn't even know what I wanted anymore. During the day, I pretended to be okay, that I was living life. But at night, reality hit me hard. The emptiness I felt in my teenage years now became something bigger, denser. And to escape that, I dove even deeper into the things that were destroying me. Drinking, partying, and shallow relationships became constants. I thought I was in control, but the truth was I was losing myself more and more. The relationships I had during this phase of life were even more complicated. I was trying to fill the void inside me through people, but all I found were shallow relationships marked by distrust and immaturity. Every time something went wrong, and it almost always did, the feeling of failure and loneliness grew. I was trying to fill the hole in my heart with momentary pleasure, but all that was left were more emotional scars. With each disappointment, I became more distant, colder, and less willing to open up or trust anyone. My relationship with my family also deteriorated. My mother continued to pray for me and tried to advise me, but I was so hardened that I refused to listen. Every time she tried to talk about God, I responded with disdain or silence. I avoided visiting my parents' house because I knew my mother would always ask about my spiritual life. I didn't want to give any explanations. My father, who was never very involved in faith, also began to worry. Although he didn't say it directly, I could see in his eyes that he knew I was lost. Then things started to spiral out of control. I was 24 when I lost my job. It wasn't a dream job, but it kept the bills paid. I lost it because of my irresponsibility. I was so immersed in that reckless lifestyle that I missed work constantly. And when I did go, my mind was anywhere but there. When the dismissal came, I felt the impact directly. Without a job, the bills began to pile up. And soon I realized I was at a dead end. Trying to run away from my problems, I turned even more to parties and the wrong crowd. By this point, I wasn't just drinking occasionally. Alcohol had become an escape valve for all the pain and frustration I was feeling. I thought drinking would help me forget the failure I had become. But at the end of each night, reality hit me even harder. Over time, I realized I was becoming dependent on this escape. Without realizing it, I was sinking into an addiction that began to consume my life. It got to the point where my health began to suffer. The constant, sleepless nights, the stress of living without money and without purpose, and the abuse of alcohol began to take a toll. I felt exhausted all the time, both physically and mentally. I remember one night in particular when I was alone in my apartment, sitting on the floor, looking at the piled up bills, the phone cut off for lack of payment, and feeling a deep emptiness. I cried that night. For the first time in years, I cried. Not for something temporary, but for myself. For my life, which seemed meaningless, directionless, hopeless. I had hit rock bottom. I wondered where I had gone so wrong. Everything I had done as a teenager seemed to have led me to this exact moment of pain and despair. Nothing I had built with my own hands seemed solid. Friends? Most had distanced themselves when they realized I had nothing more to offer. Relationships? All failed. Work? No prospects. At that moment, I looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. Someone who, years ago, still had dreams, hopes, and a future ahead of them, but now was completely lost. It was during this phase, in that total darkness, that something began to change inside of me. It wasn't immediate, but I started to remember my mother's words, the prayers she had said for me over the years. As much as I wanted to resist, these memories kept coming back to my mind over and over again. I tried to push them away, but night after night, when everything around me seemed to be falling apart, it was as if God was beginning to whisper to me, softly through the prayers I knew my mother was still saying for me. I was at rock bottom with no way out, but in that moment, without knowing it yet, God was already beginning to work. After so much time living at rock bottom, something inside me started to break. It was as if the walls I had built over the years were finally beginning to crack. I kept resisting, trying to deal with my problems in my own way, but everything I did seemed to fail miserably. The more I tried to escape, the more I sank into the void and darkness I had created for myself. One night, after another frustrating day where nothing seemed to go right, I found myself alone again in my apartment. The weight of my choices had become unbearable. The debts were piling up, my health was worsening, and my relationship with my family was practically non-existent. I had no one left to turn to, and the feeling of being completely lost became more and more evident. That night, something different happened. Sitting on the floor, too exhausted to get up, I began to feel a deep anguish. So deep that for the first time I was overwhelmed by a desire to cry out for something greater, something I had always resisted recognizing. I felt as if I was in an internal battle. My mind insisted that there was no hope, that God didn't care about me. But my heart, broken and tired, began to long for what I had rejected for so long. Unable to bear the silence any longer, I said the first words of prayer that had left my lips in years. It wasn't a beautiful prayer. It wasn't full of the right words. In fact, it was a cry of desperation. I said something like, "God, if you're really there, if you're real, please help me. I don't know what to do." To my surprise, as soon as those words left my mouth, something changed. It wasn't a thunderclap or a heavenly vision, but a different kind of silence took over the room. It was no longer that suffocating silence I had felt before. It was a silence filled with peace. An inexplicable sense of calm began to fill my heart. In that moment, even without fully understanding, I knew God was there. I felt as if someone had lifted me off the floor. There was something new inside me, something I couldn't explain. In the following days, things started happening almost supernaturally. I remember one specific day, shortly after that prayer, when I received a phone call from a friend I hadn't seen in a long time. He knew I was going through difficulties, and without me asking, he offered to help me find a job. That felt like a light at the end of the tunnel. I accepted the job, and somehow I began to feel like things were changing. But the real turning point came a few weeks later when I accepted my mother's invitation to visit the church. She had been inviting me for years, but I always refused. This time, something inside me said I should go. I sat in the church pew with a heavy heart, but open in a way I had never allowed before. That service, the pastor spoke about the prodigal son, the story of someone who, like me, had run away from everything God had for him, but eventually found his way back home. Those words felt like they were directed straight at me. As he preached, it was as if God was speaking to my heart, telling me that despite all my mistakes, he still loved me, still wanted me back. I remember for the first time feeling something I had never felt before, deep repentance. But at the same time, I felt something even greater, an unconditional love, a love that surrounded me in a way I had never experienced before. When the pastor made the altar call at the end of the service, asking those who wanted to give their lives to Jesus to come forward, I didn't resist. I, who had spent so much time running, finally surrendered. I stood up, my heart pounding, and walked to the front. When I got there, I knelt down and began to cry. It wasn't a cry of sadness, but of relief. It was as if all the pain, frustrations, and disappointments I had accumulated over the years were being washed away in that moment. God's presence was so strong that I could barely speak. In that moment, I understood what my mother felt in her prayers, what she had always wanted me to experience. It was God's grace, a love I had never deserved, but that had reached me anyway. It didn't matter how much I had run. It didn't matter how much I had resisted. God had never given up on me. After that day, my life truly began to change. It wasn't an instant process, but with each step I took, I felt God by my side. I began reading the Bible with a hunger I had never had before. The words that once made no sense now seemed alive. Every verse spoke to me in a new way. Prayer, which I once saw as an obligation, became a refuge. I started talking to God like a friend, and every day I could see that he was listening to me, guiding me. What impressed me most about this process of transformation was realizing that, even with all my failures, God not only forgave me, but restored me. He began to rebuild everything I had destroyed with my wrong choices. I regained hope, started believing that my life had a purpose. For the first time in years, I felt whole. Not because I had achieved something, but because now I knew that God was in control of my life. After that encounter with God in the church, my life was never the same. Slowly, everything began to change. It wasn't an instant process, nor was it easy, but with each passing day, I felt that something new was being born within me. That void I had carried for so long was finally being filled by God's love. For the first time, I felt like my life had real purpose. The first step in my journey of redemption was to restore my relationships. I started with my family, especially with my mother. I knew the pain I had caused her over the years was deep. She had spent so many nights praying and crying for me, and now I finally understood how much she cared about my soul. I needed to ask for forgiveness, not only from God, but from her too. I clearly remember the day I went to my mother and said, "Mom, forgive me for everything I put you through." The tears started rolling down my face before she could even respond. And the most incredible thing was that she, with the same love as always, just smiled and said, "Joao, I never stopped loving you. I always knew that God had a plan for your life." In that moment, I realized that God's love wasn't just something I was experiencing spiritually, but something I had seen in my mother all those years. Reconciliation with my family was an important step. I started having regular contact with my parents again, visiting them frequently, and most importantly, praying with them. This experience made me realize that God calls us not only to restore our relationship with Him, but also with those we love. My mother became my biggest prayer partner, and together we began interceding for other family members and friends who were still far from God, just as I had been for so long. My financial life also began to rebuild. It wasn't magic, nor was it easy, but with discipline and the help of friends God placed in my path, I found a better job. And with that, little by little, I began paying off my debts. But the most important thing wasn't the money itself. It was the fact that I now worked with a new sense of purpose. Every day was an opportunity to serve God, even in the simplest tasks. I knew God was with me, guiding each step. Another area of my life that underwent a great transformation was relationships. I realized that the choices I had made in the past, trying to fill my emptiness with people and shallow relationships, had never led me anywhere. After giving my life to God, I understood that my worth and identity weren't in what others thought of me or how accepted I was socially. My worth was in the fact that God loved me unconditionally and had a plan for me. It was a process of healing. I began to distance myself from the company that led me down wrong paths. I made new friends at church, people who helped me grow spiritually and supported me during difficult times. It wasn't easy to leave behind some old friends, but I knew it was necessary. Some of them, over time, even approached me to ask what had changed, and that gave me the opportunity to share what God was doing in my life. Slowly, some of them started attending church with me. God was using my story to touch other lives. I began to get more involved with the church ministry. I started by helping with small things, like assisting with events and organizing activities for the youth. But as my faith grew, God began to call me to something more. The pastor of my church encouraged me to share my testimony, and at first I was nervous. Talking about my past and the things I had gone through wasn't easy. But when I stood up to tell my story for the first time, I felt a peace that could only come from God. The words flowed, and I could see in people's eyes that they were being touched. That's when I realized that God wanted to use my life to impact others. I began to be invited to share my testimony in other churches, at youth meetings, and even in small Bible study groups. Every time I spoke, I felt more of God's presence strengthening me. And the most amazing thing was seeing how other people who were also far from God or going through difficult times began to open up and seek the transformation I had experienced. God didn't just restore me, He gave me a new purpose. Today I live to testify about what He did and continues to do in my life. I'm not perfect, I still face challenges, but now I have one certainty. I'm no longer alone. That emptiness that once consumed me has been completely filled by the love of Christ. And that's something I want everyone to know. No matter how far you are, no matter how much you've run from God, He never gives up on you. The addictions that once controlled me no longer have power over me. The pains of the past have been healed, and the emotional wounds I carried for so long have been transformed into scars that tell a story of redemption. Life may not be easy, but now I know that I have a God who fights my battles and sustains me through every difficulty. Today, I'm a new person. The Joao who once ran from God no longer exists. In his place is someone who was rescued by grace and now lives for the purpose God designed from the beginning. That young man who rebelled against his mother's prayers is now a man who prays every day, who surrenders to God with a heart full of gratitude, and who, above all, knows that there is no better place to be than in the Father's arms. This is my testimony. I spent my life running from God, but He never ran from me. He was by my side the entire time, waiting for the right moment to rescue me and show me that His love is greater than any mistake, any distance, any resistance. Today, I know I belong to Him, and nothing can separate me from that love. If you are going through difficult times or feel distant from God, remember, He is calling you. No matter what you've done or where you've been, Jesus loves you and is ready to restore your life. Don't postpone this meeting with Him any longer. Open your heart and allow the Holy Spirit to transform your life. And before finishing, I want to ask you to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share in the comments what God has done in your life. Your story can also inspire and uplift others. May God greatly bless your journey of faith. Until the next testimony.